So welcome to what is actually the first substantive session of FSI. It's a pleasure to be able to do for you the kind of introductory talk about the subject of the week that I've been giving at FSI really from the beginning, although it has gone through rather no small amount of evolution since the first time I began giving this talk. Not so much as a function of events which have taken place since the beginning as because of my own expanding understanding and the expanding understanding of those who form really the core substantive team of people, not merely at ICNC, but also among our academic advisors and all those with whom we regularly communicate and whose work we respect and digest as it comes forward. One of the criteria we use in determining who we like to communicate with or receive content from is whether they are pushing the envelope of the existing paradigm. It's not just the paradigm we started to push when A Force More Powerful was developed and distributed. It's also what exists at any given moment as a paradigm about understanding nonviolent action when it is being used effectively, which is to say, when it is being used, as we would argue, in a strategic way, not necessarily defined by simply having what you call a strategy, but in its effects on power. The use of the term force more powerful as a term was directly derived from Gandhi, but by piecing together two pieces of a sentence. There are a few words in the middle of that. And when Howard Thurman was visiting Gandhi in 1937 in India, he was peppering Gandhi with a lot of questions. His secretary was taking notes. And one of the questions was, do you think that nonviolent action produces a force of some kind that is responsible for some of the effects that it has? And Gandhi sort of was reacting in sort of a chastening manner, as if he were not really scolding Reverend Thurman, but he responded and said, "A force." He said, "It's a force more powerful even than ether," or which was a scientific concept at the time, or such and such, more powerful even than, and he went on about it. So the title comes from that, although interestingly, that was not, the way that got remembered was by the wife of the producer of A Force More Powerful, who thought she remembered Bernard Lafayette in a clip in one of his interviews using the phrase "a force more powerful." In fact, Bernard did not use that phrase. Bernard said "a power more forceful." And so Miriam was misremembering that. But so when she gave me "a force more powerful," I thought, you know, wait a minute, that sort of slightly sounds familiar. So I go to my Gandhi reader, and I'm flipping through all the pages that I've underlined, you know, or that I've, you know, marked in some fashion. I'm having to read them all to see because why did this sound familiar to me? And then I found this passage with "a force more powerful," and I say, well, Bernard didn't get it quite right, but maybe Miriam wouldn't have remembered it in this form, and we wouldn't have found the original quote. But power was the leitmotif as a key concept in the production of A Force More Powerful, so that the political and social effects of what we now more frequently call civil resistance could be seen as not merely having a powerful effect in a fanciful sense, but having the ability to deploy power, to produce power as one would normally think of power. Because of course what we wanted to do was to move the understanding of this beyond the size of the community of those who really did have a good understanding of this, whether they were coming from the perspective of strategic nonviolent action as originally framed by Gene Sharp, as adapted and in some ways accelerated in various respects by my colleague Peter Ackerman, but also from the perspective of Gandhian nonviolence, because the concept of power that I presently possess with respect to what is produced by the use of civil resistance I cannot explain to myself except by reference to a number of different sources of ideas. So I think the definition of this is a work in progress. And I think just like movements and campaigns are a work in progress, as I'll be telling you. So this is essentially an OR text, if you will, for the rest of the week. If there were a Venn diagram of everything that you'll be hearing this week, this would be this little slice sort of in the center somewhere where all the other circles overlap. Because variations of this thematic framing can be found in a number of different contexts of looking at civil resistance, regardless of the specific subject that you're approaching. So my wager is that has always been with respect to FSI. I'm going to give this first because I think that this is the pebble dropped into the pool that in a cavern that you'll hear echoes of, all during the course of the week. So now I have to plunge you into darkness because you'll never see these slides unless I do. So don't do anything funny while the lights are on. I was supposed to do it. No, that didn't do it. Oh, that did it. Okay. So I think the question always has to be asked with respect to any image or any story about nonviolent action that you see in the media. You need to ask the question, what is this? I mean, what is it called? What should we call it? Not just to get the nomenclature right, but we should certainly call it something that is relatively accurate with respect to the actual phenomenon. Is it just unrest, which is one of those ambiguous words used even on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Guardian, when they don't quite know what to call something that sort of looks like protest, except people aren't waving signs or picketing or doing that kind of thing, so they're not sure. So they use the word unrest, and the next word along that line is turmoil, and then you're handing opponents an advantage of defining it in terms that they would rather like it defined as. Or is this simply just opposition? Is this just the political opposition? In some countries now, yes, mass protest is used as an oppositional tactic, but does that make it civil resistance or nonviolent action considered strategically? Or is it just protest? People just angry and getting out there and blowing off steam? Or is it an uprising? Or is it a revolution? All these terms are used now in a confused fashion by the mainstream media in order to be able to describe what this is. We call it civil resistance, and we think, when I say we, I mean all of my colleagues in this room who have studied this and are engaged in the effort of teaching it with our help and with the help of other organizations. It's an emerging force, historically speaking, for rights, construe that as broadly as you wish, and justice, construe that as broadly as you wish. By the way, does anyone here know where that image is from? Yes, exactly. But I like the red, that's why I used it. Stories, accounts, narratives, even ideas, and certainly academic papers about this subject of which there is now a flood, have within them, as well as media discourse, two entirely different ways of looking at political and social phenomena. Most media coverage of anything political is usually defined in terms that you see on the left-hand side of these two lists of words. Most stories about what is political have to do with states or their opponents, with governments, if governments are being challenged or are exerting power in some fashion, rulers in states which seem to be ruled by elites or by single individuals. But all states have laws and want people to obey the law. And then there are informal elites, which usually populate the offices of those governments and states. And there are public institutions and private institutions, which also are thought to possess power and therefore possess power. And there are conditions in which all these various actors are having relationships with one another, and most of those conditions are described as if they were physical. Well, we have to find out, you know, what the poverty level is in that particular society, or we have to determine what the educational level is, as if you have to have a certain minimum number of smart people in order to organize a movement. Intelligence helps, but is that the determinant? Or simply unrest. Unrest is the absence of structure. So that's an easy term to use that's consonant with with the way in which most observers and even many participants in movements and campaigns will tend to define what they're doing. But for each one of these ideas, there is an equivalent concept which points the way like a road directional sign in a different direction. And this is the vocabulary of agency, which is to say, of what is causal, of effects in some sort of human process. So, but we also have some fairly fancy words that are being used, albeit unknowingly, in expression of agency. Non-state actors. So that's the current popular technical term, or term in the academy, to account for the equivalent of states. So maybe non-state actors can possess power. We're making progress a little bit, at least in the kinds of media in which you'll see that word. Citizens are not the antonym for, but at least the equivalent term for governments. People, consent, instead of laws being the chassis of legitimacy, it's whether the people are giving or withholding their consent, thus having an effect on the perceived legitimacy or felt legitimacy of the institution, the state, or the authority that's being challenged. The equivalent of elites are civil society. Again, this is terminology coming into greater use in the last 10 to 15 years. The equivalent of institutions, movements, the equivalent of conditions, skills, thus my colleague Peter Ackerman's paper that he keeps evolving on the relationship between skills and conditions, which is more important in determining the outcome of a nonviolent conflict. The equivalent of what is physical is what is political. What is political is not necessarily physical, much less parliamentary or juridical or executive in its fundamental reality. And resistance, I would contend, is the proper term, obviously, for unrest. The more we move our own vocabulary and the more that we subtly invite those who want to understand these activities and conditions from the left-hand column to the right-hand column, they'll be approaching the locus of power as it's deployed by nonviolent movements. This is the man who has the first sophisticated definition of how power is produced by people that so far I've found. Full description. Of course, this is Frederick Douglass, the great campaigner against slavery and abolitionist in the middle years of and later years of the 19th century. The first African American to be invited to a meeting at the White House, by the way. That president was Abraham Lincoln. So he said, power concedes nothing. This is a term, this is an unyielding air to this. He starts with an unyielding proposition for you. Power concedes nothing, and it never will. Find out what any people will quietly submit to, and you found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed on them, and these will continue until they are resisted. You'll get oppression until you mount resistance. He was under no illusions about the inclination of states or rulers of any kind to do favors for you. The limits of tyrants, he says, are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. Some people don't like that sentence because it sounds like he's blaming those who are being oppressed for their own oppression. No, he's not blaming them. He's suggesting that the failure to develop a way to resist effectively won't change anything, obviously. So whether or not your mode of existence is going to be effective is going to have something vital to do with the endurance of your opponents. About a half century after Frederick Douglass, Leo Tolstoy made an interesting remark which I think is predictive of perhaps a state of affairs which has still not arrived but may in the future, when he said that public opinion, which he didn't mean, by that he did not mean the results of a public opinion poll, he meant what people are thinking, what they believe, the opinions of people, the informed opinions of people, that public opinion would eventually change the entire structure of human life. And that would make violence superfluous. That violence would no longer be resorted to, at least as a measure to be used against established power, because some other methodology would be developed that would accomplish the necessary changes. And that methodology would have to rest in some way upon the volition and the action and the opinion of people. Hannah Arendt says that Socrates was the first one who saw that doxa, the Greek word for opinion, was the lever for developing a consensus about what could be done and enough agreement within the community to rally support for taking that action. Gandhi is in a direct line of intellectual descent from both Douglas as well as Tolstoy. He knew all about Tolstoy and had read almost everything that Tolstoy had written. I'm not certain personally if someone here might know whether he was familiar with Frederick Douglass. But he did read the newspapers at the time when he was in South Africa in the first decade of the 20th century, knew all about Irish resistance to British rule, was fascinated by the tactic of rent strikes, and studied newspaper accounts of the 1905 Russian Revolution, which also involved strikes. The evolution of thinking about just the tactical form of resistance came to the point in the 1970s when Gene Sharp began to develop a categorization of different tactics and proposed this categorization. There are others. They're all useful to look at. This is interesting because it disaggregates protest, which is ostensibly a form of persuasion, marches, walkouts, symbols, vigils, from non-cooperation, which is something that actually applies pressure. If you boycott a product, somebody's income is going to go down. If you strike, if you subtract your labor, it's harder to create that product. If you do a sit-in, physical obstruction, or engage in civil disobedience, you're imposing a cost on the opponent, which is maintaining the oppression. And intervention he classified differently because he felt that that was a more extreme measure than forms of non-cooperation, although you can see it as an extension of civil disobedience. So I've already said enough to define the dynamic of resistance. When people deprive an oppressor, here's, once again, Frederick Douglass, when the people deprive an oppressor of their consent, some people call this the consent theory of power and dispute that. This goes back a very long way in human history, this concept though. When people deprive an oppressor of their consent, I'm not going along with what you're proposing because I think it's wrong. It reduces the potential perceived legitimacy of that action. Legitimacy is in play as an influence on the way people think in a larger group or community about the context of action. And when enough people refuse to cooperate, you're getting to the tangible cost of the system that holds control, that does the oppression. Obviously, oppression is the effect of establishing control so you get all the money, or so that you get all the power, or you get all of whatever it is that you want. It's about control. So you have to destabilize control. When legitimacy goes down and costs rise, something else happens. When you're at this point, you're developing a robust challenge to established power. Because what happens then is that the people who are enforcing the orders of the oppressor, the people involved in a corrupt system, realize, they see that A lot of people are very unhappy and have definitely decided that this system is not legitimate. And they're doing lots of things which are making the cost of the existing system go up. The good news about corrupt systems is they're very vulnerable because to do normal state activity, you have a very thin profit margin because so much money is going to illicit purposes. So this is a whole field, by the way, that has never been adequately theorized or developed, which is the economics of civil resistance, but really should, so that this can be mapped in some quantitative way, because it never has been thus far. But when the people following the orders doubt the endurance of the system, they have to begin to ask themselves, well, wait a minute, I'm only 30 years old and I've got 2 little kids at home. Am I still going to be working for this guy in 10 years or 15 years? What if he's out by then? What if I become a diehard? What if I'm with him to the last? What's going to happen to me at that point? Everybody begins to think creatively about the future, even the people within the system itself that needs to come down. Our contention, and I speak of myself and my intellectual colleagues, is that the record of this form of resistance to a greater or a lesser extent, just in the 20th century, and the beginning of the 21st century, has had an extraordinary record. You can all read the names of those particular conflicts. Most people in the room are familiar with those conflicts, though there are a couple in here that some people aren't familiar with, like Mali in 1991. Ask our academic advisor, Stephen Zunis, about that later this week. He's one of the people in the room who will understand that struggle. What the Maldivians did in 2008 is very interesting. You can ask me about that as well. This is an impressive record. We think this is an impressive record because this transmission of power, gradually, sometimes invisibly at first, from an oppressive or a corrupt system to a body of people who've had enough, happens in this fashion. This dynamic is somewhere at work. It may be unstated. It may even, and in many of these movements, it was not known that this was the dynamic underway, because this is an analytical frame, obviously, that we have devised after the fact. Just one metric for the results. Erica Chenoweth will talk more this week, and you'll receive free copies of the book that she and Maria Stefan wrote called Why Civil Resistance Works. This is another metric. It's part of a Freedom House study in 2005. In the 35 years between 1970 and 2005, there were 67 transitions from authoritarian or autocratic rule around the world to democratic governments. And in 50 of those transactions, the key factor was some form of nonviolent coalitional force. And coalitional is equally important in this respect, whether it's a coalition of political parties or popular fronts or popularly based organizations. Some diverse mobilization was occurring within these societies. Where does all this happen? So my first question is, what is this? Where does it happen? Where is it really going on when it gets traction? Is it really physical at all? I think that the answer to this question can't be provided until you examine the language that campaigns and movements use, not just their leaders, the language that ordinary people are using, and the quality or the character of their motivation. I think there are two kinds of language, two kinds of political language, and thus two kinds of political motivation. I'm willing to be this reductionist about it. Let me take the second one first. There's what I call instrumental language, in which the object is manipulating behavior. That's advertising. All commercial language is intrinsically manipulative. It's a set of content that's geared to your personal material self-interest. So your participation in the commercial decision, or now politics, your vote, is rented. Just so long as it takes for you to buy the sell. If you buy that selling language, they're not interested in you any longer. Modern political parties in evolved democracies all use this kind of instrumental language, and political psychologists will go on television and say that it's normal and applaud the parties who are doing this well. This doesn't speak to what is already in the minds and hearts of ordinary people to be mobilized. The language that does that is what I call ideational or even in some cases existential language. It summons devotion to the content of the cause. It's the content of the ideas that a movement stands for, because those ideas are meaningful to the people, and that resonates with the sense of identity that already exists, perhaps only in a latent form among those people. And that identity is a function of the answer to the question, who are we? What do we stand for? What's going to be the legacy to our children? We have a material legacy, but surely the lives of our children have a meaning beyond the fact that they're going to be relatively well-fed, that they're going to hope that they can be more well-fed than they are now. What kind of a country are we building for the future? Do we face a situation of hopelessness? Will the future always be like the present? That's implicit in using instrumental language. You're not addressing any of that in instrumental language. You're assuming that people can be manipulated with the ordinary political language of the world today. Certainly most of the language used today. But find me a very successful movement, and I'm relatively confident that I will be able to find within that not simply a slogan, but a set of ideas that are represented in the way people are talking about what the movement makes, that have the capacity to switch people on, that have the capacity to awaken them, not simply to real conditions in the society, but to who they are, and therefore what their movement should be. Their movement should be who they are in terms of their aspirations and their desires for the future. These women instinctively understood that. These are the mothers of the disappeared. They were the ones who started the slippery, who sort of tipped the land in a certain way, just enough, just a few inches up, so people began to slide down that gradient. The regime and the supporters of the Argentine regime in the 1970s began to slide slowly down that gradient, loss of legitimacy, more costs. When there was terror, when the sons and daughters of these women were being dropped out of airplanes over the ocean or the river or the harbor, they decided to go into the central square in Buenos Aires and say, we're the mothers of the disappeared, and we have come to ask, where are our children? They didn't make a political statement. They made an existential statement. And there was no one in Argentine society at that time who could fairly say, that's not a proper question. Their children have disappeared. And this was, of course, right in front of the Central Palace, that they asked this question. And then they were wearing diapers as scarves on their head. So someone inside that palace made the decision that it would not be a good idea to arrest those women. They weren't making a political statement. They wanted to know where their children were. And they were wearing diapers on their heads. This was spontaneous brilliance as a tactic and as an ideational proposition. Elements of this can be found in the unifying propositions or the galvanizing propositions in so many movements or campaigns.
Just want a full screen on there.
Pardon me? Oh, sorry. Oh, thanks.
There you go.
Great, thank you. This is the central proposition that I found in Gandhi's language stating the purpose or the cause of what he was doing. He said close to this language in a lot of different kinds of ways. It was like a concept that he was like, squeezing and applying and kind of trying to milk it for all that it was worth. So the British are ruling this country for their own benefit. So why should we help them? So that last line echoing the idea of Frederick Douglass. The British are not here for our benefit, even though that's what they're telling us. So right away challenges the legitimacy of what the British are saying. They're not ruling India for our benefit. They're ruling it for their benefit. Look at all the taxes they take from us. They make us buy salt that they have made, and then they tax us for the privilege of selling that to us. And we're paying that. We're sustaining them in this country, and we're sustaining their economy at home. It was a powerful economic argument that drove to the heart of the equation or the relationship in effect, the exploitative relationship between the occupier and those who are being occupied. Movements that are formed and directed on the basis of these propositions about what they mean to the people who they wish to mobilize over a period of time not only become effective, I would contend, they also impart certain properties to the society, and that's how the society changes. Sometimes unknowingly they change the society because of the way people are being talked to. One of the reasons that people will join a movement is because they're being addressed in a completely different way than they are accustomed to the state addressing them or to a local oppressive ruler addressing them. And one of those, there are a lot of these emergent properties, but I'm going to give you a few of the key ones. The first and most important one, I think, is reason. You cannot get someone to commit to do something to you which is going to involve great risk to them unless you respect how you find their state of mind at the time that you're talking to them. You have to respect the mind of the person you're addressing. You have to respect people as citizens. As if you're suggesting to them they have a duty, you'd better respect their definition of that duty and take that on board. Thus, what has come into existence between you as a relationship, between you as a leader or as an activist and someone in the campaign, is a process of persuasion. It's not, you're not saying you should do this because otherwise we will fail, blaming them for what might be your failure later if they don't join you. That certainly isn't a proposition that will respect the other person. That's coercion. There are lots of propositions that you can put to people that you can recruit, which are not so much persuasive as they are coercive. That's not going to develop the full potential of mobilization, in my judgment. And then the propositions you put to them have to be reasonable. They have to show that you're honestly describing conditions. If you honestly describe conditions, you'll be seen to be credible. So respect and persuasion and credibility are all aspects of public reason. The absence of public reason shows a desiccated public space. Movements win in part because they restore healthy public space, healthy civic ideas to a desiccated public space. And this is why they attract respect and why they often are more effective in mobilizing. And when they mobilize a sufficient number, something becomes taught to people by involvement in actions in campaigns, and that's responsibility for oneself and responsibility for the group. In other words, self-rule. And of course, Gandhi famously used the Hindu word Swaraj, meaning in so many words self-rule, and suggested that how can we expect to rule India if we can't rule ourselves? Self-organization, planning actions, discipline, in the case strategically of movements that use civil resistance, nonviolent discipline, components, necessary components, I would contend, of self-rule, and therefore of effectiveness in a movement. Imagine these qualities being imparted to millions of people in a society in which no one has had any responsibility and no one's interested in their opinion before. These are heady and exciting experiences just to be able to have the experiences of the things you learn in a movement. This is why movements are doing things we don't yet fully understand. When there is leadership, when there is activism, when activists are communicating with people that they want to mobilize, right from the beginning, they are effectively asking people to join them so those people can be represented. Because even though you may not be the ultimate representative of the people who are your core in doing a movement, everyone together in that movement will claim to represent a far larger number of people who they hope will be supportive in less active and less involved ways. Representation is the core of modern democracy. It may not be the core of a future mode of democracy, but it certainly is an active component today. The idea, the very act of engaging in representation requires you to ascertain what people's grievances are and then to present those grievances to others. It requires you to listen to people. It requires you to delegate certain authority and action that you believe you possess to those who have listened and have agreed with you or changed your mind, and together you have a new narrative to present. You can't do any of that without humility. You can't do it hierarchically, really. I'm convinced that movements or campaigns which have a long list of who's president, vice president, secretary of this, that's hierarchy. It may not be an indication of humility. And this does represent solidarity of all, not the heroism of a few people. This model is utterly different from authoritarian regimes. So if you have an anti-authoritarian struggle, representation, I would suggest, is a very important feeling or component that you need to convey. And the fourth one I want to talk about is resilience. Now, resilience or staying power or the ability to endure even reverses and difficulties by a movement is thought to be sort of the sine qua non of effectiveness. It's the sign of it. It's the essential final ingredient. It's by the time that you have become resilient, you probably have generated momentum. How is this developed? Where does it come from? And I have an image of Fannie Lou Hamer here, who was the famous leader of voter registration drives in Mississippi in the 1960s during the American Civil Rights Movement, because Jim Lawson told me a story one night which involved her and others in the Civil Rights Movement. She, coming back from a successful voter registration drive one night, was dragged out of her car by police who had pulled her over and beaten up to the point that she almost died. She was taken to the hospital. She was in the hospital 30 days, and on the 31st day, she started another voter registration drive. So Jim asks me, why did she do that? Would the ordinary person do that after having almost died because of the repression used against her? And his answer was, she did that because she felt that if she didn't do that, the movement would fail. But if she did it, the movement would succeed. This is the full existential identification of what's one's own fate with the fate of the movement, which really means, if the movement is representing everyone, the fate of the people as a whole. It's not just shouldering momentary tactical responsibility or even, doing strategic planning or all those other things which are important in a movement. It is saying, this has become my life for right now. And the presence of people like that in a movement, not merely as an example, but in the consciousness that can exist in a movement, shouldn't be underestimated. That produces resilience. So the basis of resistance on a number of different levels, in a real way, is a choice of identity. You ask yourself the question, who am I? Or the question from one person to another, who are you? Are you the object of a ruling elite? Well, yeah. Are you submissive to threats of repression and violence? Yeah, we have been in the past. Or, potentially, are you a citizen? Even if citizenship has no meaning in that context yet. Are you a citizen able to develop the means to obtain power, to win your rights? So then the question becomes, where are you? My third question of the night. And I want to acquaint you with a very interesting concept that I came across while reading Adam Michnik, the great Polish dissident. Maciej Bartkowski knows much more about Adam Michnik than I do. We both met him, but an extraordinary figure in the intellectual history of nonviolent struggle in the 20th century, quite apart from what he did in collaboration with Solidarity at that time. But he had an interesting suggestion about the location of where this happens. He conceived a set of ideas, Michnik did, to fight against what he called the captivity of the spirit. He had a Polish word for this, which I won't try to pronounce. But he defined it as the capacity of individuals or collective subjects to be the authors of their own lives, capable of reflecting on their lives, and capable of autonomous action. In a word, and this is from his text, he wanted Poles to be. That when they were living in this old frame with the authoritarianism and the corruption and the poor material conditions, they didn't have full being. They couldn't be fully who they were as human beings. And so, he said, being had to be reimagined. What it meant to just be had to be reimagined. They had lost the capacity. And again, a huge sort of slap across the face kind of challenge. Wake up, you know, do you think you're really being a human being in this set of conditions? You're not. So how do we reimagine being? So where are you? You're in the process of using your imagination to decide who you can be that you haven't yet been. Again, where is that taking place? It's first taking place in thought. It's also taking place in a space that you create through the movement or the campaign. Hannah Arendt had a very interesting twist on this idea of space, which I would recommend to you. She said that public space, when you are in the process of creating the foundation of a democracy, is a theater. Think of it as a performative space. Think of freedom as something that you begin to act. It's very close to Michnik's idea of recreating the basis of being. Now, I'm not suggesting that what you have to do in order to understand a movement, much less in order to organize one or to be a part of one, is to either be an actor or a philosopher. But the foundation in ideas and in one's sense of oneself and in the sense of who you are together as a people, that these campaigns and movements are reaching down to activate, shows that something is going on through campaigns and movements, which isn't going on in ordinary politics, whether that's authoritarian politics or an authoritarian political system, or even in an advanced democratic system. This represents a drilling down to a level of what it means to be a full public actor and not merely a private individual attempting simply to hold on to what you have. You can understand this, I suppose, in material terms, but I don't think you can fully activate what it is that is to be activated unless you begin to challenge your way of thinking about what nonviolent action is, which is the term we use as the mechanism that is the spearhead for campaigns and movements that, as we've seen from the historical record and as we know from our study of the great movements, can accomplish extraordinary historical results. There is the stack of articles here. We can turn the lights up now. Let me. Is that doing it? There we go. I found myself exploring these ideas while I was giving a paper. I won't tell you how I got to do this, but giving a paper at a conference on cognition and consciousness at the University of California, Berkeley, a few months ago. And the title of that paper, the subtitle of that paper, was Nonviolent Movements as Applied Consciousness. And that was my fancy term to get their attention for the kind of process that I'm talking about at the end of this presentation. And I think that to me, it's a sign that the understanding of these phenomena and the understanding of the ideas which help explain these phenomena, it is at a very early point in development, because there are capacities we possess as human beings that we have not yet fully developed, that may only be in embryonic form, that we may see illustrated here and there. Some of the literature I've consulted convinces me that we may see it in the arts and literature and in other types of human endeavor, but may not yet be seeing it in any form of politics or even in any form of social organizing. So the discovery of the full potential of any particular movement is the responsibility of those who would not only organize that movement, but also seek to understand and to describe that movement, whether they're a reporter or whether they're an academic, because understanding that passes into the popular imagination comes from the media, and it does come from academic life, because there are lots of organizations like ours which serve as a transmission belt from those who do serious scholarship, like the academics in the room tonight, and those who translate those ideas into forms which can be assimilated not only by those who might be involved in movements, but also by ordinary people. So my sense is that the subject that you're going to be discussing this week with a variety of extraordinarily bright and capable people who've done extraordinary research and also extraordinary deeds out there in the real world is opening doors to facets of experience that are beyond the political and beyond the social, but may have an important and a dynamic application within the political sphere and within the social sphere. But the most important message, as I said a few minutes ago, is that don't believe anybody who tells you, I understand this. This is ridiculous. Or, I understand this. Read this book. That's all you'll need. We're at the beginning of the process of understanding this. We're not even a quarter of the way through, as best I can see. So, welcome to the party. Comments, questions, ideas?
There's a couple questions.
Back here.
Yes.
I just had a question. Is it possible to have the PowerPoint sent to us?
Yeah,
Because I couldn't-
the PowerPoint?
Yeah, I'd like.
You can have it, sure.
Thank you. That's
Absolutely.
the question.
Steal this book. Exactly how you said it. Alana, you had a question?
Yeah, I actually had two comments/questions.
Okay.
The first is when you spoke of the power of ideas.
Right.
So I understand where that comes from theoretically. That comes from Gramsci's ideation and hegemony. But what I didn't understand was how you split it between ideational versus instrumental. Because to me, instrumental is a part of ideational. So I didn't really get that split very.
Well, then you're ahead of the duality. Most people are stuck on instrumental.
Oh.
But you've got beyond that. And then you see the power of an ideational summons to participation.
Right.
If you see the power of that, you're not thinking of language any longer in instrumental terms at all, I would wager. You're seeing instrumental effects, yes. There's almost a sense in which
Yeah, so it's, yeah, you're right.
being stuck on the instrumental is being stuck on the results you want. So you're trying to do something to get to those results, and therefore you're resorting to means which are, in a sense, I would even go so far as to suggest artificial methods in order to produce that result. Thus the very the short life of the effect of the proposition you're developing.
So then I would think of it as long-term versus or sustainable versus imagery. I don't know. To me, this split would not be ideational versus instrumental.
Yeah.
It would be short-term and long-term. That's how it is.
Well, except I wouldn't suggest instrumental language of any kind, because it involves a lesser level of respect. You're simply not going to boil this down for you so forget it. I would rather have a proposition or have a set of propositions which challenge what you think of people's existence. be surprised. Those who are looking for slogans are on the wrong track. A slogan may come out of this process if it's on a substantive track, and also is equipped with ascertaining what people think, and the dialectical process that goes along with that endless conversation that you have inside movements.
I have a second comment. Now this is basically more, it's coming from my own reading of Gandhi.
Will you
And-
stand up? Will you stand up
Yes.
so we can all hear your comment?
So my understanding when I read Gandhi is that he intrinsically believes in the core power of trust. He trusts in the goodness of the other person. He trusts in the goodness of the oppressor. So he believes in this core goodness of the human being. I didn't see that in any of the messages that you had. Is that something that you consciously did not talk about, or is it something that you think maybe is not as relevant as probably in my understanding? I would still give precedence to trust over everything else in the hierarchy of what works and what doesn't.
Well, if a friend of yours loved roses, and they loved the roses because they were red, and they were going to buy all the roses you had, so long as they were red roses, and you decided to talk about the fragrance of the rose before they saw the red rose, you might not interest them initially quite as much as if you emphasize the redness of the rose. Now, those are two similar, those are two characteristics of a flower which are the same level, so it's not the best analogy that I can provide you standing right here at this point. But nevertheless, what I'm suggesting is that it's unexceptionable to say that a definition of the nation you want to produce is a good definition. It would be good if our nation represented these ideas and values. It would be good if we individually represented these ideas and values. But if you then, if the assumption about what you're saying is that, oh, in order to be effective, I just have to be good, then you're going, then you're engaged in something reductionist
Yes.
that is missing these other components. The reason to emphasize, I think that what I presented delivers the action taker, or delivers the person trying to understand the action taking, to the point of being able to see a larger frame of its potential power, which is usually neglected in studies of this form of action. And I'm not willing to give you a fully thought out analysis of how that power is produced through the process that I've sketched out. But my instinct is that that is there. And neither am I willing to be reductionist and just say, if you use these tactics and have a great strategic plan, and you run out of people to do the strategic plan, that will make you effective either. There are formulaic methods of doing this within the context of traditional nonviolence, and formulaic methods of doing this within the context of so-called strategic nonviolence. Although I don't really buy the neat separation of those two, or they're
I'm coming from a slightly different vantage point where I'm demarcating between external motivations for nonviolence and internal motivations. And I'm saying as a nonviolent resistor, for me, having this power within myself, which is trust, that intrinsically I'm so I know that you are being violent towards me, but that's not really you. That's your context. That allows me to then demarcate between the oppressor and the situation. And I find that personally to be a very powerful way of
I would
thinking
suggest
about
that's
things.
not I'll tell you my opinion. I don't know that this is a fact, it's my opinion. I don't think that's as powerful as asking a person, are you really yourself? Is this the nation we should be living in? You have to be normative at some point in your language about what is sought. And there has to be a description of that in terms other than, well, the schools have to have windows that are nicer than the windows we have now. And we've got to take the trash out all the time. You're not going to get an existential commitment on the basis at that level So this has to be, in my judgment, about something that makes a difference in terms of whether, can I live with myself or not? If you get to the point of being able to convince people the answer to that question is no, then you may be able to do a much more muscular mobilization than you may have thought. Now, I'm not suggesting that you do it for that reason, because as Michnik says, we have to reimagine how we are as a people. That's the most important benefit of doing what we're doing. You know, I mean, there have been leaders of nonviolent movements who are later successful and said, we did all the work before we even had the actual physical results, because we had remade ourselves in terms of who we knew we were. We knew we had the capability not only to develop and exercise power on our own, we also had the power to produce a new society. We knew we had that by virtue of what we were going through in order just to be able to collect ourselves as a plenum within the society.
Thank you.
Just to comment with a different model that maybe touches upon
Sure.
what was just alluded to regarding Gandhi. You have a victim, you have an oppressor. The victim wants to throw off the oppression. The trick is, how do you throw off the oppression without becoming an oppressor yourself? Gandhi suggests it's not so much trust you need, but a recognition that if you destroy the other people, you're destroying what is.
Yes.
And you get closer to truth the more you gather in everything that is, instead of destroying other things because you're lifting something else up. So in the process of becoming a non-victim, you become the actor, the real being that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And the trick is to become a real actor without becoming an oppressor on
Well
top
said.
of that.
Well said. Yes.
I'd like to ask, because you talk about in the representation,
Yeah.
the part that you say
Excuse me, I can't understand what you're saying, and
I'll
I'm sitting
repeat
very
it.
close to
Mary,
you.
I'll repeat the
Okay.
Okay. And you mentioned we should be in the group, we should be a hierarchy.
Right.
Yes. So but I'd like to ask a question, if there are many people in the group, and how do they mobilize themselves? And and another thing is you mentioned about the self-organization. When I study master, I also learned about the self-organization, but
Staff organization? Oh, yes.
self-organization,
Sorry.
yes. And then I feel like that is a self-organization of the group. And if the group would like to organize themselves, and if they don't have the leader, or if they don't have the mobilizer, how do they do in that kind of thing? And in Thailand right now, I would like to share some experience, because many of the leader, that try to anti the military government right now, they are arrested. So they don't try to have how they say, obvious leader. So, but they do some kind of anti-military campaign through the Facebook or through the social media.
Yeah.
But I would like to know from you, if in some society they don't have such kind of internet connection, or how do they mobilize the group without the hierarchy system?
Yeah, well, you have to make a distinction between, the question, Mary, was she wants to know how you can actually inspire, this is my words to describe what you meant, inspire a following unless you have some organizational structure in order to be able to reach those people to engage in the kind of activities within an organization that is normal. I'm not suggesting that one can do seances and inspire everyone to simultaneous glorious acts without necessarily having some kind of organization within a campaign or movement. There are many different kinds of organizations. My objection is not to organization. My relative objection is to the idea of hierarchy. Because hierarchy connotes a sense of, connotes levels of status with respect to decision-making authority. Now, most Western organizations, whether they're political, corporate, even nonprofit organizations, have hierarchy to the extent that this person has more responsibility than this person has more responsibility than this person. If you organize on that basis from the outset, a campaign or movement, my guess would be that that would be less effective than if you did, what did Gandhi do? He traveled around India for several years. so he could ascertain the state of mind of Indians, as well as their grievances, and also think about ways of inviting participation. I think participation is invited. It's not compelled, it's not sold as something even that's exciting necessarily, because I think it's identity-based. I think participation is identity-based. I don't think that I don't think that it's a means to some further end. Ultimately, the experience of being in a movement does become an end in itself for lots of people. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because that end is related to the social or political end that people desire, to begin to develop those values within the campaign or movement. So I'm really not objecting to that, but what you're putting your finger on is something, you should ask that question of Deborah Nutter, the Senior Associate Dean of the Fletcher School, who teaches the leadership module on Friday, because that will open up the question of different modes of organization and of organizing, which could have a really important impact. Some might be, that you might think are perfectly useful outside the context of the campaign or movement, might be toxic even in a campaign movement, and others might be really fruitful and have all kinds of possibilities.
Well, if you take that, the question about organizational structures and also the question about instrumental language, I perceive it more like these are several different traits that we are working on the way to our perfect society, whatever. So, and in some ways, it's easier to get rid of a dictator than to get rid of hierarchies within the oppositional movement.
Totally.
So it is more like, I would see it as a suggestion on what things we have to work on
Right.
if we want to
Right,
reach our aim.
right.
So,
No,
and I
Right.
mean, like all the activists, we do shortcuts. I mean, we and sometimes
Right.
we have all this very nice basis,
Right.
grassroots
Right.
discussion and thing, and then somebody, the three remaining people make a decision and everything falls
Yeah,
out.
yeah. Well, I mean, I guess my comparison was between the traditional structure of political parties and political institutions in a conventional democracy, much less in a non-democracy, and the political action that takes place within a movement. So that, because hierarchy, traditional political organizations in the West are replete with hierarchy, are suffused with hierarchy. I'm not suggesting that campaigns and movements can or should be led in a religiously anarchic fashion either. So, and that's...
We try.
Yes, some would believe that. Jim?
Well, that's one of the reasons why nonviolent struggle is far more difficult and perplexing
Yeah,
than any other form of struggle that I know
yeah,
about. Because you are trying to get the consent of people to do the struggle.
yeah,
They have to have reasons for doing it.
yes,
And yet, it seems to me nonviolence also, at least says to me, that the way you struggle and the kind of community and structures you build as you struggle are critical to the consequences. So that my view is that the hierarchical systems are of little value for genuine nonviolent struggle. Though Gandhi was the boss in terms of the
Right.
independence campaign, but that was partially because the Nehrus and the Patels said, you've done this work in South Africa, now do it here for independence. And at different times said, you have to do it. Martin King was not hierarchical in that fashion. There was endless talk about different campaigns, and then night and day talk within within the process of the campaign. You really, in order to try to help make decisions that seem to be effective for the moment. So that kind of consensus process did take place.
I agree.
Wait, here's-
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to follow up on the conversation.
Excuse me, maybe it's possible to use a microphone because many people can understand. Microphone for him or.
This is just recording, so it doesn't have.
The other?
But go ahead. Answer my
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on the conversation that's going on because what makes the difference in achieving that organization that is not really hierarchical and that sustains the movements, even though we don't have that formal structure of that formal hierarchy existing? Because before Reverend Lawson came in, I was going to come back to say maybe it would be important to tap from how they managed. Because when we followed the video, especially yesterday, you would notice there was no point we knew this was the head, or this was really organized, and this is the chairperson of this movement. Today, this person is taking leadership. We just saw people acting. So what happened to create that understanding within people that they will give up that selfish love for me being the head and seem to be the head and seem to be the lead? Yes.
Who'd like to answer that?
Well, I don't know if I will fully answer that, but that's coming from our Ukrainian perspective and from all the initiatives that are taking part right now. You just take responsibility for the part of your knowledge there. So you know you're in the group of the same age and professional-wise experts, and you take a chunk of knowledge and process you can develop and contribute. And the structure becomes horizontal then. You work on the same level, you can address or change each other in the work. But then of course you all see who is the leader or the good person to represent, and in current I think world that should be a person who is able to do PR very well, who can promote like your activities on social networks and spread along the people. So that,
You said earlier, you're not the only one to say it, legitimacy comes from consent. So similarly in a group, if a group provides consent that this person has the authority because they have the expertise, it's fine to let somebody lead, but there has to be consent that the person is worthy of being a leader, and that's a consensus. I mean, so I'm not sure, Jim, that you wouldn't have a hierarchy, but it would be a hierarchy by consent that could change.
But you can also change that though, because in the national campaign in 58 and 59, no one had done the in-depth study of nonviolence in the United States, in the scriptures, in Gandhi, in Europe, in South Africa, as I had done. So I did have a body of knowledge and experience that I was willing to use. But as we started the campaign, we formed the structure for the campaign that we called the Central Committee. It had a majority of students on it from the 4 or 5 different campuses from which students had been recruited. And then a number of us who represented the community. So I made some rules. One rule that they accepted was that we would, if there was a press conference, it would be a student and an adult from the community doing the press conference. In the mass meetings, there would always be a student, a clergy person, or some other adult speaking for the struggle. When we had major negotiating committee, we had always a student and a chair from the community. So that therefore meant that you prepared leadership. Students objected to this, that this was not normal for them. But I insisted in the Central Committee, well, that doesn't matter. This is also an operation where you have to learn to do these things. So from the beginning, you decide that there are things that you could do and you should do. So there'll be equal leadership. I sought to create a climate in which there was an equality of treatment of all the people, younger or older. And that it helped to prepare people not only to do the work that had to be done, but also gave them a better and deeper understanding of what a nonviolent struggle can be.
So leadership requires, or should imply, the capacity to distribute leadership.
Yes, exactly. I never did a press conference in Nashville, and haven't done a press conference to this day in Nashville, period. And I did it quite deliberately.
Francisco, please.
Considering that intervention, the last intervention, a leader can be created or you born as a leader. It's possible to create really a leader, or you just born as a leader with personal characteristics, these kind of things. Because many people used to say, we'll give you a training about leadership. But on the other hand, if that person taking the course has not self-confidence, have not strong beliefs, have not a personality, I don't think you can just receive a certificate saying that you are a leader. What do you think?
Well, you're invoking a commonly believed notion that leadership depends upon pre-qualification from a body capable of providing pre-qualification, so that there is a reference to some sort of to external credibility. You know, in my job, I have to read lots of academic papers. I like to read academic papers that have clarity about ideas more than that I like to read academic papers that cite and defense, cite one source in one paragraph and attack another source in another paragraph, or gently, indirectly attack the source in the next paragraph, which is to say, jumping fences, avoiding fences to jump in order to be able to find one's way to where you're going instead of paving a new road. That's a very circuitous way of saying that. The quality of leadership isn't always telegraphed in advance by reference to an external authority. Movements and campaigns are famous for growing leaders from directly within the core of action in initial form. Not necessarily that's the only way they come out. But now we're turning this into the module on leadership rather than into, but you make a very good point, and I'm going to pass the buck again. Ask Debbie Nutter on Friday. Yes?
I just want to add on what Dr. Reverend James said about this. It's just my own opinion, but I think that I don't think that that there exists a flattened, totally horizontal structure where everybody is a leader and there are no followers. I think that it is necessary, especially in civil resistance, of the existence of inspiring and charismatic leaders who lead and who make decisions. But I think that these leaders should delegate power from time to time, allowing followers to make decisions and take them into to distribute power from time to time.
Well, the question of how to structure decision-making in a campaign, if you put it that way, which is to say, instead of who becomes a leader and what do they do, how are decisions made, and what is the process by which we can organize ourselves so we're more likely to reach decisions which are going to produce effective action, then you're going to look at the types of action that you'll need to engage in. And those actions in turn will be evaluated on the basis of, to use my terminology, the costs you're going to impose, and in terms of legitimacy or actual material costs, and the support and participation that you'll be able to mobilize. And then when you talk about all of the various features of action, when you, in a sense, detail the dynamics of civil resistance, you'll raise to the surface implicitly the kinds of human skills that would be useful to have at those various points in undertaking the action. And then that will suggest to you the kinds of leaders that you actually need, so that in turn, based on who you're already working with, might be good at this and this and this and this. That's why eventually full political leaders come out of that earlier, not just tactically based process, but the formative process in a campaign or a movement. That's how leaders emerge. It's not just because they look smart, or they give a good speech, or they wear nice clothes, they look good at the front of the crowd, or that sort of thing. It's more that they've shown themselves to be good decision makers about things that are vital to the movement, and particularly are effective in getting people to follow, not follow them as having some aura, but follow them as having the capacity to give guidance in a way that works. That would be the way that I'd sort of frame that.
Charisma, I think, is much to blame. Being socially magnetic, able to communicate vision, etc. Being characteristics of life.
Thank you.
Quick comment, actually, just to comment on your comment. In the Syrian case, when I speak to activists in Syria on the ground, I found this very interesting dynamic among non-violent resistance like movements at this local level. So, and I found it pretty interesting that since nobody's making money out of it, and they're all in this movement out of true belief of change, they just want, for example, more political freedom, or they were personally affected by certain law. So those people, for them, who's the leader is irrelevant question. It's the goal. It's what they want to achieve. And then if, in a case, if they needed a leader, then the leader emerged depending on the situation. So where they're protesting, if they're in this specific city, then probably that person could be a better leader. So the focus is on the goal and what they want, and leadership is irrelevant. Maybe because this is not, maybe because it's at a local level, small scale, and not so much maybe organized, that you would think it's not organized. Whereas you have more competition of leadership when there's any external factor of like, okay, now we have funds from, for example, foreign countries. Now we may expect some money. So this is like, there's different factors that could play into who would be the leader in that dynamic.
Well said. Yeah, somehow I'm reminded of the old Zen Buddhist story in which the young, what's the word, acolyte, or the young, who's the person that
Disciple?
or novice, exactly. The novice goes to the master, sees the master walking down the corridor early in the morning, and goes to the master and says, "May I have a word with you?" And he says, "Of course." He says, "What must I do today to see eternal truth?" And the master says, "Have you had breakfast?" And the novice says, "Yes." "Then go wash the dishes." Yes, Frederick.
I find it fascinating that you point to the language, that basically if you want to have a nonviolent movement, the language also should mirror that. And I guess this concept of nonviolent communication, which comes close to it, and which is basically how you switch the question right now from leadership position towards decision-making process. And you started, when you introduced this, that you looked at the different movements, how much they use this kind of language compared to other movements which are maybe not using it. Did you find a systematic difference also in their success, or what comes out of the movement?
Well, my acquaintance is largely with successful movements, because that was the research that I had to do to write The Force More Powerful with my colleague Peter Ackerman. And I read lots of cases, actually, as well as news accounts of what's going on in movements. And I think that it's a larger problem, of course, than the language you use. Typically, what seems to be happening is that In journalism, crank back 40 years, if you were at a radio station, as I once was, reading the news, you went to the ticker machine and you ripped off some paper which had the latest stories. And you went immediately to the microphone and just started reading. And that was called being a newscast, ripping and reading. Is what you call, you can be in the news business just by ripping and reading. So that became a phrase, rip and read, is the way you become and there's sort of an equivalent of that in almost all kinds of human organizations. Everybody is so busy, and maybe we can get by if we just rip and read. You know, we don't really have to even understand what it is that we're doing or that we're reading, as long as we can just get it done. And then that leads to the famous American expression, which I think is a Midwest expression. Oh, that guy, he gets it done, you know. It's like, that's all I need, just get it done. But if that's the, and there are some movements and campaigns that look like they feel that somehow they have imitated the model of what they think a successful movement is, or a successful campaign is, or what a campaign is, and that somehow there is something, there's some fairy dust on that. Part of that is a function of the sense that there's a certain amount of that that appeared to be happening in the Arab Spring, which is very quick results, as in Tahrir, not really quick since that particular aggregation of people was organized, although not quick from the perspective of all of the development in civil society that had taken place over the previous decade, of which that, frankly, was the fruit in many ways, because of the diversity of people who were represented and all the people who had various kinds of complaints and who had become welded into this effort, to some extent spontaneously, or at least opportunistically, because the circumstances presented itself. But when you see something like that, and then you think it's just, well, then that led to the false idea that, oh, well, you need social media to execute your campaign. Then that was the new single factor analysis. You know, as long as you can get Facebook, okay, that's what we need. We need Facebook. And so I think that there is the tendency to want to find this, as we say in the U.S., the silver bullet, tactically, the tactical silver bullet, is understandably a product of impatience, a product of wanting to do what you believe you've seen as successful, but you're probably just reading an account that says it's been successful. It's a normal human kind of reaction. If you have to answer the question, though, who am I and what do I stand for? Who are we and what do we stand for? That's going to take a little bit longer. So you're naturally going to engage in a discursive process. You're going to argue with people, and that's going to, there's going to be that begins the production of not only of the goals of the movement, but also probably its ability to generate a spirit of some kind, which is part of the cohesiveness down the line. When you do that, obviously, then you're at the brink, I would argue, of potentially being able to summon a much bigger effort. I don't just mean big physically and quantitatively. I mean in both its assumptions about what it may be possible to do, as well as the scale of the change it may wish to be. It may be going for. But I take your point. I think that I think that the evidence of this is abundant. I don't think it's been properly organized or assessed, to be honest with you. You know, my own particular specialty or field of experience is language. And so what that's the subtitle of that article, the subtitle of that article is Nonviolent Movements as Applied Consciousness. But the subtitle of the book I'm writing is Language and Meaning in Movements. How do you get a movement, which is a carrier for meaning, to everybody who it purports to represent? And how do you do that through language, understanding that that's not just the press release, you know, or the 10 goals or the manifesto or whatever. It's not just like the document. That's one little example. If you reduce writing to a tactic expressed in a piece of paper or in a web page, then you've instrumentalized what you're doing, because you want somebody to react to it. You want a certain number of hits, or you want a result of some kind. You shouldn't shape language for those holes or those targets. You need to shape language to answer the question, who are we? You know, and then descend from, not from that level, not from a cosmic level, because those are questions that people will bring their capacity to identify with what you're doing too. They'll bring that capacity to identify with what you say you want to do to being asked that question. Very few people are going to bring their capacity for complete personal identification with the movement to the question of how would you think of what should this press release say? What do we have to tell the engineers? Can you give me an idea on that? Oh, okay, let's think about what we should tell the engineers.
From the outside.
Right, right. You know, I used to write speeches for guys running for president, and they always had answers to the question, what do we want to do for the nurses? What do we want to do for, you know, truck drivers, if the guy had to give a speech to the Teamsters, or whatever? What do we have to do for these people? You know, it was a bit like, what do they eat? Okay, do we have that in the kitchen? Okay, we'll deliver that. You're not, it's effectively useless if you want to really summon support that's going to be resilient, as I suggest. Yes?
Yeah,
Diane?
yes, I'll stand up since I'm in the back. I have a question about funding of movements. I work primarily with victims of very serious crimes, and they often will form movements to advocate on crime. But then what I see happening is very well-meaning NGOs and UN agencies will see them, and they'll start giving them money to support their work or to change it, to do more work. Oh, you work with abducted children? What about all war-affected children? And what I see is the movements are destroyed. I mean, just in country after country, I see when that happens, those movements turn to internal fighting and they're destroyed. And in Uganda, where I'm working, we now have probably 3 or 4 different movements all claiming to speak for victims for this national reparation. And it's just like one national victims meeting after the next, and the same people are not invited. It's all being funded by outside donors, all well-meaning. So what's going on, do you think, with external funding, very well-meaning, and what's happening with integrity of movements?
I could pass the buck to 2 different speakers later this week. Maria Stefan, as well as her respondent in the discussion that will happen in that particular session. But I'll answer your question because I do have a view about it. Ivan Merovic's answer. Is Ivan here? No. Ivan's answer to that question is take the money and do whatever you want to do. And if they don't give you the money again, fine. At least you will not have wasted your time listening to them about what they think you should do, because whatever they think you should do probably is wrong. Full stop. That's typically his answer to that question. But, you know, I think that I don't think that all external support, even support which takes a purely financial form, is necessarily contaminating. But a lot of it is, obviously, based on the character and purpose of the organization. And whether, I won't use the term strings attached, because there's usually not explicit conditionality, but it's usually an understanding that a movement is going in a certain kind of direction and will exhibit a certain kind of performance, or won't say outrageous things, or won't do this, or won't do that. Don't embarrass us, is usually the wish and the hope, you know, of the funder. But the question really should be asked from the point of view of what generates mobilization, it seems to me, is what do we need to do in order to be able to ignite and organize very broad and diverse membership, followership, involvement at least. What do we do to develop broad and diverse involvement? Then, are there, with respect to the opportunity of funding, is there anything that we want to do, that as an example, that's going to cost us some money? And if so, is there anything in the society that is available to us, to use a philanthropic term, that's the equivalent of gifts in kind? So we don't have to take money from this big foundation, but people will help provide for what we want to have done. If we need something printed, is there a printer? Is there, some of the most interesting struggles are against military occupation, because then pretty much everybody is willing to do something. And most of those struggles have needed very little funding, because you have a lot of people who are willing to contribute what they know how to do, or things they already have, their services. And those services can be really very useful. Those aren't necessarily available in all, they're not available in all kinds of struggles. But if you want to look for alternatives to actually needing cash, look at the anti-occupation struggles. Jacques Semelin will be here giving a lecture on discussing really his life's work in part on Wednesday morning. And he studied all of the World War II anti-German occupation struggles, as well as other modes of resistance to oppression, sometimes extremely violent repression. And really is extremely interested in community-based resource development, if I could use that long term. That wouldn't be his term. He'd have probably a brilliant French expression for this. But so that's an alternative. I don't think there's a doctrinal answer to the question of, whether external support should be embraced or should be rejected, because it depends on the donor, it depends on the purpose, it depends on the conditions and all the rest, and whether you can defend it to those who are maybe suspicious of it because of whatever the agenda is of the organization. You've got to take all that into consideration. I think it's probably a bad idea for nascent movements, particularly if they have political objectives. Now, in this day and age, when there's an active, coordinated disinformation campaign coming from certain leading authoritarian regimes about the whole idea of nonviolent movements, which is new just in the last 3 or 4 years. So given that, you want to be very careful about that. You can defend that if you can develop a good argument. So I don't think, as I said, there's a bad answer to that. Yes.
Maybe just a comment to that, that the nurses like me, or that these people like me, or that I get money, but rather looking at what do I want to do and how do I see to get this, because that's like lots of experiments show that people, if they get money for it later on, they think they just did it for the money and they don't identify so much with it if they don't get money for it. So, and like if it's really coming from the community, if they are doing it, they are more connected and it's more looking at their identity, why am I doing it? So that's maybe one part why money can be problematic.
Yep, definitely. Yes?
Well, during your presentation, you mentioned around 10 cases as violence movement, and I was wondering if you did that on purpose, depend on you think these movements, successful movements, should be considered, or if there's any standards that these non-violence movements are successful or not, or can be considered or not?
Well, there are lots of criteria about what produces effectiveness at the level of the movement as a whole that you can look at, or really looking for indicators of effectiveness. But those particular movements were what I call nation-changing movements. I saw, when I started to do the original research on this subject 16 or 17 years ago, I realized that there were some movements which had managed to change whole nations, which had essentially remade the nation. And those were really interesting. How had they done that, something of that scope? So the ones on that list were what I called nation-changing, certainly national political direction-changing, at least. And so we wanted to examine movements of large scale because at that time, the late 90s and the early, about 10 to 15 years ago, there was the assumption, well, nonviolent movements are nice, they can do this or they can do that, but history is the same. And we wanted to challenge the notion. It sounds like, no one would say now that movements can't change history, but people were saying that only 10 or 15 years ago in the media and in policy circles. What? Don't bore us, please. Don't take up my time even discussing this. I don't want to talk about this. Now they want to talk about it because there have been so many movements and a succession of movements, and there's been reaction to that, convulsive events. But but I think that the a movement that is significant to the people who benefit from its results. So that can be a very small movement. And when the direction of a community is changed by virtue of a movement, even before the results actually occur, then that's significant to those people. There's the famous story I'm reminded in that context of, with respect to the idea of why a local movement can be just as significant to a certain body of people. The famous story of the anthropologist Lauren Isley, who, great writer of books for popular circulation in the West in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And he writes the story of himself, which is something that happened to him walking down the beach in the evening, probably on the Atlantic coast of the United States. He lived in Philadelphia. And the tide has gone out, and the beach is flat and wet in the light that still exists. And all on this beach, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of starfish stranded on the wet beach that the tide will never be able to reclaim and presumably will die. And he sees this boy, who looks like he's like 14 or 15 years old, taking these starfish one by one by the arm of a starfish and casting it into the sea as if it were a plate or a coaster, very gently, but getting the starfish back out to sea. He says, "Why are you doing that? There are hundreds and hundreds of starfish there." And so the guy throwing the starfish was holding one starfish, said, "Why is it important to do this? Look at the hundreds." He says, "It's important to this one." So that local, individual campaign may be tremendously significant, like Botha's campaign in Cambodia. Because in this day and age, and why we thought that was worthy of being lifted up for appreciation and understanding as it continues, is because it could be emblematic. It could speak to someone else's imagination somewhere else. Look what this person did in these circumstances, rather dramatically. Okay, maybe there was only a brief tactical success that one time. Maybe there's so much more to be done, and this is an incomplete struggle. So the fact that I put these big nation-changing movements up there, I'm not saying restrict your study to those movements. By no means. It all depends on what you want to do where you are, or what you want to study, if it's just a matter of study. Macrocosmic, microcosmic, they're all over the place. Yes, Razik, you raised your hand.
The power fixed to that to be carbon. So I just tried, instead of raising hand, I just stood up.
Good.
Because after the second question, I was trying to raise my hand. Anyway, no, just two questions. Very interesting, very moving discussion. Some of the questions that I've been dealing with were very clearly expanded, and I get lots of insights. One question is that we have been working in a society which is predominantly primitive, and all the power that is given to the politics of nonviolence has an urban manifestation. If you have urban, state-oriented, if you operate in a state-oriented, urbanized machinery, you will be able to, make a dent in the system through all these nonviolent means, disobedience, disobedience, and stuff like that. I come from a society which is primitive and who do not have any sort of urban centers, and where people even do not primarily relate to the systems or institutions. So it's become very difficult. We've been negotiating with political elites and the ones who are struggling for their self-determination and using primarily violent means to do that. They say that we do not have all these strengths for nonviolent action. The strengths, you cannot just stop and the streets and block the streets, and you cannot just make your voice heard unless you make certain destructions. Yeah, this is the side of an excuse, but this is what this is. So what are,
Okay, it's time to go back to Gandhi for a little bit, a minute on this. I'm reminded of how he sometimes amusingly discussed how the British had thoughtfully provided a national train system for him to use to run around the country to ascertain what bothered people. But he didn't just collect grievances in a big grab bag of grievances. He looked for not just persistent complaints, but complaints which represented a sense of deep-seated unfairness, which was directly traceable to specific acts of the British occupiers. And not to manufacture rage, which I don't think works, by the way. In an article that I wrote recently, I said, rage depletes, it does not nourish. But he was looking for what would start the self-questioning about the willingness to basically do nothing about the fact that the British were running the country. And found all kinds of material, basically. I mean, if he'd been a playwright, he would have found material for a dozen plays on this theme in his travels around India. So when he walked X number of 100 kilometers to the beach at Dundee, he wasn't collecting rich and famous people along the way. You know, he had found a series of propositions that were fused into a form that managed to appeal to all of his listeners, or most of his listeners. And now, that's a very general answer, and it's not a full answer to your question. But I don't think that there have been some writers, some skeptics about civil resistance who say, well, this is an urban phenomenon. I think the successors of those are the ones who say, well, social media might do it, but nothing else other than social media does it. Who's the name of I'm forgetting the name of the Russian writer who is skeptical about all nonviolent movements and also skeptical about social media at the same time. I'm forgetting big debates going on about the political significance of the internet. But I don't think that, I refuse to believe that people who live in cities characterized as sort of out of it or having simpler needs and desires are not capable of being organized. I don't think that any human beings who are aware of the fact that they participate in a society cannot be organized. The book you should read is James Scott's book called Everyday Weapons, or Everyday Resistance, The Weapons of the Weak, or The Weapons of the Weak, Everyday Resistance. And this was, Scott is a political scientist who sort of became an anthropologist in a way, in order to study tribes in Southeast Asia, indigenous peoples in Southeast Asia, who were engaging in everyday forms of resistance against bossy, tribal leaders, women resisting men, tired of having men beating them. This is like the most primitive people in the world who are using all of this sophisticated nonviolent resistance, which he writes about in absolutely accessible form to everyone. Because he was finding the resistance there, maybe forms of resistance that didn't require massive, horizontally extended organization, but he was seeing the mechanism, seeing what people were saying to one another about this, and respecting their minds and respecting the choices of the action that they took and trying to account for why it worked. That's not the only book on this subject, but that's just the one that comes to mind.
You've heard me say this before, but Gandhi became a national leader by leading a number of local movements. King became a national leader by leading a number of local movements.
Right.
You get a national movement by having local movements that are replicable, not by having a million-man march on Washington
Right.
for a weekend.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you very much.